Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Ashley Vandifort. I'm part of the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Planning Committee. And for anyone who wasn't on our first presentation this morning, a little brief introduction to Zoom. If you look on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat feature in the middle of it. That will allow you to ask questions. All of you are muted for the presentation, but you can type your questions into that chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, on the far right-hand side of the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reactions button depending on what feature you're using. That gives you an option to applaud or give a thumbs up when Sjana is presenting. So with that, I will start out by introducing Sjana. So the presentation today will be done by Sjana Schanning with the Superior Rivers Watershed Association. Her presentation is on Circumnavigating Lake Superior by Kayak. During the summer of 2018, just after Sjana's 40th birthday, she spent 3 months kayaking the nearly 1,500 miles around Lake Superior. An ecologist by profession and a committed volunteer for a nonprofit watershed association, she thought hard about what she hoped to get from this trip. In the end, she decided she wouldn't be blogging for awareness or clocking miles for a fundraising stunt. The trip was about her and the lake. Join Sjana for pictures and stories to celebrate our own personal adventures on the waters we love. So with that, you can take the floor, Sjana.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see the picture of the big lake and the nose of my kayak right now. Is that correct?
Looks great, Sjana.
Good. So the keynote speaker, Ian Carl, did such a great presentation and really emphasized the importance of our connection with water, and that obviously extends beyond children and into all of our lives. We're all here today because we feel energized by the water, and we feel like it's such an important part of our life, and engage in so many different ways with it. So I had this idea for quite a while about circumnavigating the lake, and shortly before about 3 years before my 40th birthday, I realized I better get on it. But before I tell you about that trip, I want to do an introduction myself, and that is, of course, to the impressive Lake Superior. So many of you already know this, I'm sure, and I'm sure that you know Lake Superior quite well, but I hope today to introduce you to a piece of her that maybe you haven't seen before. At almost 32,000 square miles, Lake Superior is the largest lake on the planet by surface area. And during my circumnavigation, I paddled close to 1,500 miles of shoreline all the way around. But if you add in the bays that I didn't paddle and the shoreline of the islands, the shoreline stretches over 2,700 miles. And that's a little bit over, actually, a line drawn straight across from California to the East Coast of the US. So she's got a lot of shoreline and a lot to protect as well. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 quadrillion gallons of water in Lake Superior, and I can't even process that much water. And sometimes that might feel like that amount of water in itself serves as a protective quality. And we might be fooled into thinking that our own actions don't have or won't have much of an impact on the lake. Of course, everyone here knows better than that, but we can get sucked into a little bit of a lull sometimes thinking about that. But the thing is that the turnover time in Lake Superior, the time that it takes to refresh the water, is 199 years. So that means that currently we are all benefiting from the fact that the last 200 years have been relatively undisturbed. And so of course, though, that also means that what we put into the lake now, how we treat the lake now as stewards, means that that impact will last well beyond our lifespan. And so the lake certainly has risks already, and we are witnessing some of those in our lifetime. We see invasive plants and animals from ships and shipping channels, and potential for proposals for iron and copper mining that could have significant impacts on the lake, gas and oil pipelines, and then even at the ridiculously cold temperature, annual average temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even climate change is having significant impacts on the lake. And so we as stewards have to figure out how to engage and how to be active to take care of this global treasure that we are lucky enough to live by. One of the ways that I have found to do this, to be a steward, is to be an active volunteer for the Superior Rivers Watershed Association. And this organization was founded by local citizens in 2002. They were concerned about a lack of data in the area. We have a lot of very pristine streams and rivers, but that means that there might not be as much attention because people think that they're fine, and attention goes to more impacted areas. So the mission of the Superior Rivers Watershed Association is to promote and protect clean water resources in Lake Superior's, Wisconsin's Lake Superior Basin. And so we are a science-based organization, and the work that we do, the volunteers and staff, is to work on river restoration projects that impact the land going into the lake and the rivers going into the lake to help reduce sedimentation and improve fish passages. We get volunteers, we organize volunteers to do river monitoring, to measure water chemistry and macroinvertebrates, that kind of thing. And then we also work with teachers and classes to bring classrooms out into nature and experience the rivers in terms of monitoring and all the things that the water has to provide. So this is the area, this outlined green area. These are all the watersheds within the sub-watersheds. And this is the area that Superior Rivers Watershed Association focuses our energy on. With more capacity, we would love to expand further, but currently, given our current capacity, we've focused our energy on this area to make as big a difference as we can. And just a few pictures of the many faces and projects that the Watershed Association engages in. So, as I said, Ian did such a great job about talking about the importance of being in and on the water. And I also felt the need to separate myself from daily life, even separate myself from all the work that the Watershed Association does and the efforts that I was putting in as well, and just experience this thing that I love so much. And so shortly before my 40th birthday, I took 3 years of planning and figured out how I could take the time from work to do this trip. And you will see down here in the nose a little 30-mile, I think it was a 30-mile stretch that ended up, I was unable to paddle it. I just made the decision to end up skipping that. There was Grandma's Marathon going on at the time by Duluth, and this road was closed, so I couldn't really get off the lake because there were so many people, and it's very cliffy, and there was a lot of weird weather. So I didn't paddle that, but the rest of this blue I did. And it was an incredible journey, and I saw just such beautiful places, and I love photography myself, and I do agree with Ian that it connects us so deeply, and it takes our mind to another place and helps me to focus on all the little artwork that nature provides. So what I'm going to do with you now is share with you a small stretch. I wish I could share more. It was so difficult to narrow this down. I had a horrible time figuring out what wasn't important to share. But what I'm going to share with you now is a few stretches that I did. And the first stretch is this one. It's just past the US-Canada border. And actually where the blue begins down here, I went clockwise around the lake. And so I went from west to east on this stretch. And down here in the bottom, I actually had a friend join me to paddle these 8 days. So from down here, which was Little Trout Bay, up through these islands, Thunder Bay is over here, it's labeled, and up through the islands and up here to the town of Rossport. And so she joined me for 8 days, and then actually my husband was able to come up and visit. So he met me in Rossport, and he didn't paddle with me, but he would meet up with me in the evening, and we would camp together, which was spectacular. He was amazingly supportive. And so we'll go through this stretch, and then I'll talk a little bit about this next stretch, the Puckasaw.
Environment Canada has updated a severe weather bulletin for Northern Ontario at 7:56 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Saturday, June 30th, 2018. A severe thunderstorm watch is continued for Superior West and Nipigon, Marathon, Superior North.
So Elizabeth and I sat through a day and a night on a tiny little spit of land in our tent and watched the fog roll in and watch multiple waves of storms roll through. And the next day, we got up in the morning, we were going to get an early start, and there were still thunderstorms and severe storm warnings. So we sat tight, and the fog would come and go, and we watched this seiche come in. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the seiche, but basically what it is when the winds blow for so long and so furiously in the same direction, they kind of pile all the water up in one area, and then as they subside, the water comes rushing back and sloshing around like the water in a bathtub. And so we sat there on the shore of this tiny little spit, and our tents at the high point of the seiche, our tents were just about a foot above the water, and the full depth of the seiche from where the water was all out at the low point to the high point was about 3 feet. So we did get a little bit nervous that we would get washed out, but luckily everything worked out just fine. We watched that sage come in and out and in and out, and then the fog came in so thick. It was pea soup fog, and we listened to the weather radio, and we heard that the storms had subsided, that the threats and warnings had subsided. And so now the waters were calm, but there was still just this pea soup thick fog. But we had looked on the, Kev, stop. We had looked, sorry. We had looked on the map, and we had campgrounds that we knew were coming up. And so we weren't too concerned about having to paddle in the fog because we knew we would have stopping points. And so we decided to go for it. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we paddled out, and we packed up and we paddled out into this just pea soup thick fog. And we had paddled maybe about 45 minutes. And then I saw on the left a house, this bright red house. And I kind of saw some movement, and I said, hey, I think there's someone there. And the next thing we knew, there was a lighthouse. It's maybe like a 8-foot, decorative lighthouse. And the light had come on, and it was just rotating, shining this little light from this little lighthouse. And then all of a sudden we started being serenaded by a saxophone, it was incredible. And so we paddled over in the fog, and this woman named Ava comes running down the dock and arms in the air. Hello, you're the first people we've seen since we've got here. And we talked to her, and we told her what we were doing, and I told her about my trip, and she said, do you want to come inside for some wine? And of course, Elizabeth and I looked at each other, and we said, yeah, that sounds great. So we unloaded, and of course, we were a little stinky from our wetsuits, but we climbed out, and Ava and her husband Gordy showed us their beautiful garden on the shore of Lake Superior. And this, I should explain too, this stretch that we paddled was mostly Canadian Crown land. And so it's public land, and Ava and Gordy just had this little inholding in the islands. So all around them is just really remote, beautiful wilderness. And so we see their beautiful garden, and they've got rhubarb shaped concrete patio stones that Ava has made. They don't have access by land. This is on an island, so they have to take their boat. I think it was like about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, I can't remember. They have to bring everything by boat. And by now they've got whimsical blue heron sculptures in their garden. They've got an ode to curling section in their garden. And their outhouse is shaped like a lighthouse. And so we get this beautiful tour, and then we go inside and we talked, and it was just instant, genuine connection and conversation. It was so beautiful. And then she pours us some white wine, and we drink some wine. 6 cases, we have 6 cases of wine, she says. You just never know. And they usually, what they do is they come up in the spring, spring up there. So they come in June, and they usually stay through August. And that's where they spend their summer home. They've owned it since 1989 and just slowly been building this property to suit them. And they said that Gordy plays the saxophone for the kayakers, but not for the power boaters. So we felt very, very touched by that. So we sat inside and we chatted, and then Ava said, she put some little meat treats in the oven and fed us. And then we kept seeing Gordy going outside and like putting all this firewood in their sauna that they have outside. And I have to say sauna because I was in Canada at the time. And so he's loading the sauna, and then we're in there drinking wine, and then Ava says, all right, now go blast the stink off. So we go outside, and they've got this beautiful sauna. They've got a pipe that runs from Lake Superior to bring that cold, refreshing water into the sauna. They've got fluffy towels, which by now I was about 3 weeks into my trip, so a fluffy towel was super exciting. And we were in that baking hot sauna until we almost passed out. We come barreling out of the sauna, try not to pass out, dry off. And then, you wonder, is it going to be like an awkward goodbye? I didn't really want to camp on their land. I didn't know if they were going to offer, but no, it was just, we chatted a little bit more. We exchanged contact information, and then that's Ava and Gordy and myself and Elizabeth and their beautiful whimsical garden. And so after this amazing visit, we loaded back up and we climbed into our boats and we paddled off again and still into this just pea soup fog. And I looked back and I could just barely see the end of their dock. And Elizabeth and I looked at one another like, did that really just happen? And that was the most incredible, memorable, one of the most memorable experiences on the lake, and something I always have to share. Those two, I would say, are as much a part of this lake as any other piece of it. And it was such an honor to share them as a piece of all of this in my journey. So the next portion of the journey was this stretch called the Puckasaw. And Kevin left. As you can see, in this stretch, the road, this red line separates from the lakeshore. And this is the most remote part of Lake Superior. It was about an 8-day paddle for me. with a wind day as well included. But I think this was about 160 miles. And this stretch along the North Shore here, the North Shore of Lake Superior and the Puckasaw was so achingly beautiful. And so Kevin left me and returned home up in this northwest corner. And I paddled down along this shoreline by myself. This is national park, so I did have preset designated campsites that I registered for, but they also understood that weather and timing and all that would be a factor. And so I largely did not end up being able to stick to my preset. I actually had to get ahead of schedule a little bit to factor in a wind day that it sounded like would be coming from the weather radio. But now I'd like to share some pictures with you from this stretch, and I'll just read a section of my journal that I wrote that one of those days. During this section, I went 4 days without seeing another person. It was really incredible. And early on, I met some wonderful people at a campsite and visited with them and shared food and laughter. And then I went about 4 days without seeing anyone. And at the end of those 4 days, I was met with quite a group of people that sort of reintroduced me to society at large. And it was quite amusing. You'll see some pictures of them as well. Wednesday, July 11th, Fish Harbor to North Swallow River. Well, the day held calm and glassy and is holding still, even though I have been in camp now for about 4 hours. I can look out at the big lake from my northwest facing camp and see just how flat the water is. But I'm happy. Happy to have paddled 20 miles today and to have a beautiful and comfortable camp. Happy to have jumped in the lake upon arriving and enjoyed the sun and water, which is slightly warmed by a river flowing into the bay. Happy to have sat in another set of red chairs and have had a tasty dinner and be all cleaned up by 7 p.m. while the sun is still high in the sky. No one else has joined me at this location, and it's quite lovely. Today I enjoyed more of the astounding rock colors and the endless lake and sky to my right. I got a little frustrated by a search for a campsite I'm scheduled to be in tomorrow. I can't see any possible way there's a paddle-in campsite there. Part of my frustration was an odd little wind in the bay, which made me nervous that the southwest winds were coming early. Then when I got away from shore a bit, I could see the tops of large clouds, which I worried might be the thunderstorms come early as well. Whether due to a change in my position or an actual change, the water soon turned glassy again when I gave up and began to move toward my next option, which was this one. I saw several paddlers today, a couple resting on a rock with a tandem kayak, and then 3 boats farther out on the lake. It looked like 2 singles and a tandem kayak. When I got here, I got everything unloaded and dried out. It's supposed to rain tonight, but I'm glad to be starting with a dry tent. Tomorrow there are 15 to 20 knot southwest winds forecast. So I'm pleased to have found a beautiful place protected from those winds to call home if I have to take a wind day. There's a small waterfall, an inlet river to explore, and fish as well. Perhaps thunderstorms tonight, but for now, the sun is shining hot, and I'm comfortable sitting in the red chairs that are placed here at the end of the coastal hiking trail. I did try fishing. It was not at all successful. So it looks like I could have shared even more with you than I did. But this trip was such a re-energizing, and at a time when I really needed it. And it really helped me find my center again and re-energize me to do the work that needs to be done for Lake Superior and for all the rivers and lakes in our area. I don't know if I had mentioned it before, but there is somewhere around 17,500 square miles of watershed that drains into Lake Superior. And for us to protect that big, beautiful lake, we need to focus on what's happening on that watershed and what's draining through those rivers that we also all love and play in and look to for calm. And we need to ensure that what's going into those rivers and then eventually into the lake is something that we will be proud of over the next 200 years while our water record remains there. So I see that there are some chat things. Are there some questions? Let's see. So one question from Sophia is, how did you build up endurance to do such a taxing arm workout? And honestly, I had hoped to paddle much more prior to my trip. I did extensive training in safety over the 3 years prior. Hi, Cece. I did extensive training in terms of safety prior to my trip. I took the 3 years of planning and I attended 2 or 3 different sea kayaking symposiums, and I've been sea kayaking since 1996. And so that was really critical, but because it taught me all the things that I didn't know that I didn't know. And so I had never been introduced to a re-entry and roll. So if you roll out of your kayak and it's full of water and you're by yourself, how do you get back in? One of the techniques that people use is to climb up inside and then do a roll. And so there were so many things, and it actually also got me into some 6 to 8 foot waves with very trained guides. And so that was helpful. The 6 to 8 foot waves were not in the plans that day, but we did end up there. And I mean, I got to do rescues in that. I ended up out of my boat there. So it really helped build my confidence, and I got a good sense of all the safety measures I would need to take for the trip. But in terms of actual physical training beforehand, although I wanted to do more of it, and I was more concerned even with gaining the experience of being on the lake by myself. I was actually more nervous about that and feeling overwhelmed than I was about the physical aspect of it. But I also I didn't get a chance to do that. And I also kind of thought, well, I'll learn, like I'll get there, right? So I've got a whole summer. That's basically going to be my training. So I did, it was very interesting to see, because the first day I did paddle, and I do want to just share one other thing here. I did paddle 20 miles, which was about the average that I had to do every day. And boy, the end of that day, like I was done. You know, I had taken several breaks in between and I was done and I was exhausted. And I imagined when I was doing this trip that, oh, I would see sunsets every night, amazing Lake Superior sunsets. But I mean, it gets dark late, right, in the summer up here. And I was exhausted, like for the first many weeks of my trip. And so I remember sitting out watching one of my first sunsets and thinking, oh, I must be getting in shape because I actually can stay awake for this. So that did make me chuckle a bit. But yeah, it was basically on the job training for me, really. I'm going to leave this screen up. Maybe Ashley, you can share other questions with me because I'm not sure how to see both.
Yep, definitely. I'll read the questions off for you here. So let me scroll up to the first one. So you already answered how you got in shape. So in addition, how did you guys choose what kind or brand of tents to use?
Oh, tent. So I actually just used tent in itself is amusing, but I just actually used the same tent that we have used. It's probably about 30 years old. We've used it backpacking summer after summer after summer, but you know, sprayed it up, treated it up, and used the same tent that I was familiar with, which actually was wonderful. It was easy to set up, and I was very familiar with it. And so that worked out really well for me. But the funny thing is that Kevin joined me on the shore aspect at night when I would camp for probably about a third of the trip. And before the trip, he said, well, if we're going to be camping all summer, I'm getting us a big tent. And I was like, we don't need a big tent. This little backpacking tent we have been using will be fine, no problem. But he did end up getting like this big, I don't know, 4-person or more tent, and it's high, you can stand up in it, and it's got like awnings on it, you know, like the kind of stuff you see more frequently now at campgrounds. And I'll admit, the first time he showed up with that tent and set up one of those like big inflatable air mattresses in there with sheets and blankets, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. And so probably 2/3 of the time I was in my little backpacking North Face rock tent that's about 30 years old. And then when Kevin was with me most of the time, we were able to use our big glamping tent, and it was quite enjoyable and quite a luxury. So yeah, I just went with what I knew.
Okay, so the next question, how did you know this was going to be possible, or how much planning went into this, or was it a figurative leap of faith?
Yeah, a lot. For me, a lot of planning went in. And I do know, I mean, we live in an amazing community. We live in a community where I was able to tell people I was thinking about doing this. Eventually, when I got up the nerve to tell people that I was interested in doing this, oftentimes people in this community would say like, oh, cool, yeah, have you talked to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? Because it's not a trip that a lot of people have done. Talking to some of the companies along the shore that host kayakers and take trips and see the people coming through every summer, they estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 people a year try to do it. And so not a lot of people have done it, but I think an extraordinary percentage of the people around this area have. And so I had so many excellent contacts that had done the trip before. There's a book called Deepwater Passage that was written in the 90s, and it was one of the first things I read because it was just a book I could find about paddling around Lake Superior. And I read that book and actually contacted the co-paddler, not the main author, but the co-paddler that was in that book, who still lives in Duluth. And he was one of the first people that I connected with, and just asked questions and asked what he would change and what was important to him. And one of the 2 main things he told me that really did make a huge difference and that I incorporated in my trip is he said, don't overschedule. Like, don't try to, they had tried to plan with people when and where they were going to paddle together and have people join them. And he said, it gets complicated. And that was in a time even, you know, pre-cell phone, pre-spot tracking device, which I use, like so much at that point, you know, they're paddling and they would have to get to a payphone somewhere before they could talk to anyone. So I recognized that I had a completely different trip, but I talked to him. And then, as I said, I went to those 3 kayaking symposiums and learned a ton of safety and logistical things that were so important to the trip, and connected with a lot of people. And actually it was interesting because through the kayaking symposium, I networked with some people, and this woman, Nancy Ushhold from Marquette, had paddled around the lake mostly by herself as well. And we connected. I talked to her on the phone, and then right at the end, like right after I finished the stretch of the Puckasaw, I was paddling south along the shore, and these three paddlers, you know, were going by me. And she's from Marquette, right? And I'm up in the north, basically the northeast part of Lake Superior. These three paddlers start going by, and like I almost just kept paddling. I was having a little bit of a frustrated day at the time, so I almost just kept going. But then I was like, no, just take a breath, take a breather. And, you know, we stopped and we had a quick little friendly conversation. And they said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, actually, you know, I'm hoping to get around the whole lake. And the woman said like, oh, what's your name? And I laughed. I was like, you're not going to know my name. Like, I'm not anybody. I haven't told anybody about this, you know? But I said my name, and she said, Sjana, I'm Nancy. And we had not met in person. We had only talked on the phone. But sure enough, she was like on a 3 or 4 day trip with her husband and a friend. And we just happened to cross paths on the mighty Lake Superior. And so she was another really, really incredible resource for me as well, and helped me find some maps and other places, figure out where I could camp and that kind of thing. So a lot of planning went in it for me, but I do know people who have done it a little more last minute. And I honestly, I don't know. I think mine was the way to go, because I loved every minute of it. And I was able to find comfortable places to camp and be cozy in my tent and not have to deal with bugs, because I planned well enough to get in before the bugs were really out. And so I was very glad to have my 3 years of planning, and I submerged myself in it fully.
Thanks, Sjana. So the next statement is more of just a comment, and that's from Diane. And she said, just watching Sjana's reaction to this amazing recap and the music is an emotional whirlwind. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And then next, I have another question, which is, can you explain a little more about the red chairs? And wow, this video is giving me goosebumps. Thanks so much for sharing.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks so much for asking about the red chairs, because that's something I always want to talk about. But so the Red Chairs program is something that Canada has done, and it's so incredible. I bet my parents did the driving circumnavigation of Lake Superior many years ago, and they had kind of mentioned them to me. But so Canada, I think it's the Park Service, has put Adirondack chairs out that are, you know, like sturdy, good, heavy duty Adirondack chairs that are red, and they put them out in beautiful places. And so I think I was able to sit in 4 of them, but it's sort of a campaign to get people to share these beautiful things that they're seeing. And while you might fear that it sort of ruins the wildness of the area, for me at least, it really felt like an addition, and it was a fun little, well, especially after paddling all that way, it was like a beautiful place to sit in this nice comfy Adirondack chair. And then they'll have a sign on the chair that says, you know, like, tweet to this thing to share your pictures, which I imagined that I was going to do when I got back. And of course I never did, because I never end up doing that kind of thing. But so they have both in areas that are accessible to the road that you can hike out to an overlook, or I think even not just along the lake, but other beautiful places throughout Canada. They have placed these red Adirondack chairs. And then they also had them in some very remote places, like that end of the coastal hiking trail. Which was, you don't really know they're there, and then they just sort of appear, and I don't know, there's a little internal celebration. It's kind of fun. So it's a cool program that they've got going on. And like I said, so much of the Canadian Lake Superior shore is protected and public land, which is a really cool move on their part, and a great way to share the beauty with others.
Okay, so I think we have about 3 more questions, about 5 minutes to wrap up here. Okay. So the next is just a comment from Linda Anderson, who said that she sailed from Bayfield to Thunder Bay and then to Nipigon, which I don't know how to say that, but
Nipigon, yeah.
You bring back such wonderful memories, she says. And
it's such a beautiful stretch.
Yeah. The next question is, which boat did you choose for this trip?
Yeah, so that was another interesting thing. I had thought about buying a new boat. I have had plastic Capellas that are 16 feet long, and they have hatches, dry hatches for packing. But I thought I wanted something a little bit longer that would help track better. And I was not sure about fiberglass versus plastic. Here I kind of love plastic because I love paddling around the sea caves and sort of just being able to drag my boat up on the rocks and not worry about it too much. And I had never really had much experience with a fiberglass boat, but I talked to a lot of people who know boats really well. And again, that's where the sea kayak symposiums really came into play. And in the end, what I ended up doing was buying a friend's boat. It's a Valley Aquanaut from the 90s. And so I bought his boat. I had met him at the Sea Kayak Symposium, and he was looking for a different boat. And he said, well, you can try this one out if you want. And so I tried it out, and it seemed like it fit me really well and would work well for the cause. And so I ended up buying that boat from him. And then again, in this whole planning process, this was fairly close to the upcoming trip, but I learned how to do repairs on it, and had to do some gel coat repairs and all that kind of thing. But in the end, it served me very well, and managed to handle itself over the rocks when I had to drag it up on shore and such quite well. So I ended up using the Valley Aquanaut from the 90s. I can't remember if it's a 96, I think. And then the other main key that you didn't ask about was the paddle. And that actually was the other thing that initial paddler I talked to had talked about. Don't overschedule and get a good paddle. And again, when I went to the Sea Kayak Symposiums, I had no idea. I had no idea what I was missing. And I had this paddle that we had bought when we bought our plastic boats, and that I'd always used. And then one of the instructors said, like, here, try this. And he handed me this like carbon Werner paddle. It was like the perfect paddle. And then I ended up, and they're expensive. And I ended up having to buy two because I thought if I break, because you have to have a spare paddle, of course. And I thought if I break this paddle on the way, then I'm going to hate every stroke that I take after it using this big brick of a paddle that I've been using all along. So, so I ended up having that was almost more money than I spent on the old boat, was the paddles, but it was a night and day difference. So. And I think you said there was one more. I lose ya? Oh, well, okay, so I think everyone's still on. Yeah, so there's the second piece of advice, is get a good paddle. And then I'm kind of a ingredients packer, and so I would carry pasta and beans, and the nice thing about a boat is I could throw in heavier foods, and so I put in pre-packaged gnocchi, and I dried tomatoes from our garden and made tomato base so I could have pasta and sauce and that kind of thing, and so that's mostly what I packed. And then that was a great thing about sea kayaking, is that I could haul a lot of different heavier foods than I would backpacking. And I would resupply at grocery stores occasionally, but then also the way friends and Kevin, my husband, met me along the way, they were able to bring my resupplies. So, and then I also see a question about a Greenland paddle. I have tried them, but I haven't ever made or purchased one. They're very cool, but now that I've put so much money into my Werner, I'm probably going to stick with that for a while. So.
And then the one other question I'm seeing here is, what was the second bit of advice the co-paddler of Deepwater Passage gave you in addition to don't overschedule?
Okay, yeah, so the other piece, I don't know if everyone heard everything I just said or not, but the second piece, other than don't overschedule, was find yourself a good paddle, which I did. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Sjana. I was absolutely amazed by your pictures and stories, and it really sounded like an amazing adventure that you were able to go on. And I hopefully can speak for everyone else for how much they enjoyed your talk. If Amy would like to throw up our sponsors on there, I would like to also say another thank you to all of our sponsors who are supporting the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Convention today. If you want to give Sjana a thumbs up or an applause, you can do that at the bottom of your screen on the reactions button if that is visible to you. And I'll put in one more comment that after the convention, a survey will be going out and you will be allowed to, or that will give you a chance to give feedback on the conference as well as suggest topics that you want to see for next year. So once again, thanks a lot, Sjana, for giving that presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Great, thanks for having me.